So this is the lecture on the ontological argument. I think I've asked you to read a statement, a particular piece by St. Anselm of Canterbury. I'll check on, yeah. Anyway, so this is an argument about whether or not God exists using simply logic. Ontology is the study of the nature of being, becoming, existence, or reality. It's whether or not something actually exists, and what does it mean for something to exist. As you might imagine, this is a part of philosophy. Ology, well, y'all ought to know what that means by now. Okay, so, in a philosophical kind of metaphysical context, we're talking about literally does something, exist. I think. Now, to make sure we're all on the same page, we're talking about the existence of God. God is usually attributed two major powers, sometimes three, which is really seen as part of omnipotence. This corresponds to, as I understand it, Judeo-Christian and Islamic views of God. So, God is thought to be omnipotent, which is to say all-powerful, that God can do anything. And omnibenevolence is the idea that God is all good and all loving. And omniscience is also sometimes stated as a third quality that God can have, which is that God knows everything. But it's considered to be a part of omnipotence, because if you have the power to do anything, then you have the power to know anything. And if you know everything, and if you have the power to know everything, then you have the power to do everything, because you know how to get things done. So even though we're not using the word omniscience in here, it's considered to be a part of omnipotence. Kind of, you can't have one without the other. So some of the other writings I'm going to have you read, I think with J.L. Mackie particularly, is not going to use the term omniscience, but just omnipotence. But it's implied as a part of omnipotence. There are other divine attributes of God that are just kind of interesting. Might be, we're not going to use this as part of this argument, but I just think it's interesting to perhaps think about some of these other ideas. And if you want to write your paper on the existence of God, or if you want to write your paper on the problem of evil, it might be interesting to look at how some of these other attributes might affect those particular arguments. So, first is the idea that God is incorporeal. God has no physical body. God, doesn't take up space. God cannot be hurt. God is simple. And what they mean by this is that God is entirely one thing. There aren't constituent parts to making up God. God is just a single whole. Unity. There is only one God. Eternity. Eternity is the complete and total possession of unending life all at once, by Boethius. So God is eternal. God exists throughout all of time. God is immutable. God does not change. God is impassible. The world does not affect God. That gets interesting with regard to, if God is unaffected by the world, what does prayer or worship do? But something else to think about. But onto the specific argument I've asked you to look through. Okay, this is the person, a woodcut of the person that wrote the original ontological argument, St. Anselm of Canterbury. He was also called St. Anselm of Bec. trying to think where he's from. If he was French or German. But anyway, France and Germany wasn't really quite France and Germany at that time anyway, so, or Italy, it doesn't really matter. For our purposes, I should say. So he lived from 1033 to 1109 CE. Canterbury is in England. I think it's the main church of England. Now it's the Church of England, but at that time that would have been the Catholic Church. And he was appointed to be the Cardinal of Canterbury. It's Bishop. Okay, anyway. I like this particular woodcut because it gives him a 5 o'clock shadow and kind of makes him more human. He was associated with the motto, faith seeking understanding, fides quaerens intellectum. The other thing that we see here that's interesting about 1033 to 1109, if I was in class I would ask this of you, but you're not here, so 1066. 1066 was the Battle of Hastings, and it was the Normans conquering England. And Anselm, I believe, was in Canterbury at that time, and we know him primarily now as a philosopher with regard to his arguments about the existence of God. But he was also actually a very fine statesman and diplomat for the Roman Catholic Church, and helped to maintain the power of the Catholic Church against this huge shift in political dominance over Britain. Okay. So here we're going to take a look at the, what I call the full dress version of the ontological argument. And it's just a paraphrase of what is written for St. Anselm. It's a short reading. Do go ahead and, if you haven't read it yet, take this and then go and read it. It really is not that difficult, I think. Now we believe that you, God, are something than which nothing greater can be imagined. So this line is referring to the idea that the greatest thought you could possibly have would have to be a thought of God. God is all powerful. God is all knowing. God is all perfect. If you would think about a beautiful sunset, God is going to be greater than that particular thought. The greatest possible thought you can have is a thought about God. Is a thought about the existence of God. You can't imagine anything greater than God. Let's put it that way. And if you find something greater than your previous definition of God, well, there was something wrong with your previous definition of God. So by definition, God is the greatest thing you can imagine. Even the fool, which does not believe in God, can imagine that which nothing greater can be imagined. Now, this is intended to convince people that don't believe in God that God exists. And the fool is actually, it's a reference to a particular psalm, the person who does not believe. So even if you don't believe in God, you can imagine that God is the greatest possible thought. You cannot imagine anything greater than God, right? You can just imagine that to be the case, even if you don't believe in God. But that's not sufficient to prove the existence of God. Thinking about God, right, contemplating a thing, is not the same as saying that a thing exists. And it doesn't really matter how robust your thought is about a thing, how vivid your imagination is, it doesn't bring something about into the world, right? Doesn't exist. So I can have an imagine a unicorn. I can imagine what it might smell like and what it might feel like, what it would sound like. You know, the hooves on the floor and all that good stuff. I'm not going to try tasting it, but you know, you can imagine. I can imagine very vividly what a unicorn might look like standing here. But it doesn't mean that it exists. So right now we're thinking about God, right? We're thinking about that God is, there is no greater thought than God that we can have. And so we have this thought about, okay, a thought about God. So we haven't proved God exists yet. We were, you know, even if God is the greatest thought we can have. So Anselm gives us a painter's analogy. And he says, compare this idea of thinking about God to God actually existing. A painter imagines a painting, but he does not think that it is, right? The painter is thinking about the painting. You know, I'm going to use ultramarine blue. Now the painter paints the painting. If you're me, it looks nothing like the thought. Anyway, the painter paints the painting, you know, creates it. Now the painter can have his understanding of the painting, right? The thought of the painting and awareness of its existence too. Now the painting is. So this is the distinction between the thought of the painting and the painting itself. So, you know, you paint what you've imagined and you can go back and say, well, you know, I didn't quite get what I wanted right here, you know, what I imagined right here. And you see how these two things are different. And the thought is it's not that one is any lesser than the other, but, you know, there is the thought of the painting and that the painting is. Okay. Next premise. Things are greater in reality than in the mind alone. Now, by greater, it literally means like more powerful. Okay. They're, you know, more important, more significant. Not the way that we sometimes use the word great to mean, you know, better or best. So we're imagining a thing in the mind, right? We're imagining, let's imagine our painting, okay? And we can imagine what it would be like for the painting to exist. You can have the painting in your hand, you can smell the oils and what have you. An existing thing is greater than an imaginary thing. So I can imagine a unicorn all I want, but, you know, I can't pet one if it's not here. An existing thing is greater than an imaginary thing. What is greater? To money in your mind or money in your hand? I can think about, you know, having $1 million, you know, one of my friends has the only good reason to ever play the lottery. And it's for entertainment. My friend buys a ticket, and then until the ticket number is drawn, this person can imagine what it would be like to have won. You know, that it's as a possibility, no matter how slight, it becomes a much more interesting daydream, much more entertaining daydream. So for this person, it's it's $1 worth of entertainment. But it doesn't mean that this person would reject the money if they won. So you can imagine having money in your mind, right? You can have $1 million, or you can have it on the table in front of you. the money on the table is going to be a lot more useful and interesting than what we can imagine. So, I call this the punchline, but this is the conclusion. The greatest possible thought must exist because it is a greater thing to imagine the greatest thought and that it exists. So it is greater for a thing to exist than just to be a thought in the mind. And we've already said that God is the greatest possible thought, right? But the greatest possible thought is not as great as the thought of God is the greatest possible thought and God existing. So God has to exist. If we were in class, I would ask you, how many of you felt convinced at this moment, to find this to be, particularly appealing. The other thing I like about this argument is not that it's so persuasive, necessarily. Many philosophers throughout history have said that there's a problem with this, and they've all disagreed about what the problem is. And so it's kind of fun to examine attempts that have been made to prove this argument false. So I kind of like it because, it's probably wrong, and what we argue about is, why. We can't always agree about why we think this doesn't work, and that's just kind of fascinating to me. Okay, here is a simpler version of Anselm's argument. This is the one that I'll ask you to know for your exam. God is that which nothing greater can be conceived, in this sense, can imagined in the mind. God exists in our minds, i.e., for example, we have the idea of God. But it is greater to exist in reality than just in the mind, right? It's better to have that money on the table in front of you than it is just as a daydream. By definition, God must exist because we have the idea of God, and the greatest possible thought of God is that God is the greatest possible thought, and we have an even greater thought, right? If we think of God and God existing, that's the greatest thought. That's even greater than the thought of God being the greatest thought, right? So, and God as the greatest possible thought, therefore, has to exist. Okay, so that in a nutshell is Anselm's argument. Let's see. I think I'm going to take a break here and come back and do a second lecture to talk about the responses to Anselm. Just so you can take a break and think about it.